I think public religion is just inevitable. I think this is kind of a common theme among post-liberals as well, that you will have some sort of religion that animates and is enshrined and promoted in the public order. This is, to be honest, one of the great gifts of the woke revolution, is it just reminded us, I think, of that. Like, history didn't end Fukuyama, I'm sorry. An order will be framed around a certain vision of the good. Every political order is an instantiation of a certain vision of the good, and that vision of the good will be, in some sense, religiously inspired. Even if not every individual in that society agrees with that, the public institutions will be promoting something. And morality will be enshrined and promoted, and morality is always religiously informed. Every church has a creed. Some of them are just explicit and some of them are implicit. And I think that's true also for like a public religion. Like every polity has a public religion. Some are just less explicit and some are more so.
Hey, Pastor Adriel here with Sola Media, and I'm excited to be a part of this great conversation that we have in front of us on Christ and culture and post-liberalism. We get to discuss this together with Dr. David VanDrunen, a friend of mine, Robert B. Strimple, professor of systematic theology and Christian ethics. Dr. VanDrunen is also a minister in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and has filled pulpit for me many times. Appreciate that, Dave. And also joining us this day is Dr. James Wood. And Dr. Wood is the assistant professor of religion and theology at Redeemer University. Also with us is Dr. Michael Horton, professor of systematic theology and apologetics at Westminster Seminary in California. And he is the founder of Sola Media. Good to be with you guys today. And so I want to start with you, Dr. Wood. Thinking about post-liberalism, can you just help to define what the post-liberal view is? And what do you find commendable about this view?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I would say there's definitely not one. I'll maybe highlight some shared themes of the various tribes, which would be a critique, a fundamental critique of what goes under the label liberalism, which we can maybe revisit later, on 6 points. So one, just on the nature of freedom, which liberalism clearly references and foregrounds the theme of freedom. And so post-liberalism has a critique of the fundamental conception of freedom in the liberal order, which is it's conceived in negative terms as negative liberty, freedom from things. Also, you could look at it from the angle of ontology. It kind of drops out teleology and conceptions of natures, even if it conceives of natures as themselves important. Also, just anthropology, the human person, conceives of persons primarily as abstract individuals. And then also about religion. Religion is often in liberal orders thought about and presented as just an optional choice, as an extrinsic to human nature, as just one among many options of things you could choose to think about as important. But then also of the political order, that liberalism tends to ground political orders in human sovereignty, either some sort of ruler or democratic sovereignty that is abstracted from conceptions of the relationship to the divine, but also grounded in human wills and their choices. Get to conceptions of like the social contract theory, that legitimate authority is only that which is chosen, and then that kind of a whole social contract theory emerges to justify that. But also not everybody in the post-liberal conversation, most of them would agree with all those themes. The one theme that me and my colleague Peter Leithart probably contribute is a critique of the way that liberal orders think about the church. And that the church gets presented as just a voluntary society, and also within its divisions, there's just a bunch of cafeteria of options. And so it's kind of related to the thing I mentioned about religion just a minute ago. But anyway, those are a bunch of kind of broad themes among the various post-liberal tribes. They'd be critical of all of those, and then they have different options as answers to that. So we can maybe get to that, but there's not one single post-liberal answer to those issues, but those would be shared critiques.
That was super helpful. I wonder if maybe just even for people who are totally disconnected from this conversation, like if you were summing up the post-liberal position, what distinguishes it from classical liberalism, and you're explaining to somebody who just did not have a grasp of this at all, how might you summarize that?
Well, just based on all of those themes, most post-liberals, most Christian post-liberals, there's a bunch of different types of post-liberals, would try to promote public religion as a good. And so there's various options about how to do that, but because they don't see religion as extrinsic to human nature, unrelated to human fulfillment and things like that, but it's also not completely outside the purview of public institutions. And so they might have different answers about how to address that and how to support that and promote it. But it would reject a lot of maybe classical liberal views of just kind of leaving that to individuals. And more classical liberal understandings, right, is you try to get the state out of the way to maximize the choices of individuals to pursue the good as they see fit, right? And so that becomes kind of the way you try to minimize conflict and tension, is to make room for plurality, diversity, and things like that, especially about conceptions of the good. And so most post-liberals would say we want to promote the good, that the public institutions have a responsibility for that. And so especially most Christians would say we should in some ways protect and promote Christianity. And there's different varieties of that. You have Christian nationalism, you have Catholic integralism, you have just Christian progressivism, even of a type of post-liberalism. But yeah, the public promotion of the good, and particularly of true religion.
Awesome. Dr. VanDrunen, Dr. Horton, as you think about sort of Protestant political theology, how would you define your specific views on the Reformed Two Kingdoms? And then a follow-up question to that would be, is your particular view contingent upon classical liberalism?
I'm happy to give my little summary, and Mike can add whatever he would like as well. My understanding of the sort of a traditional classical Reformed Two Kingdoms doctrine, which is very common in the early Reformed theological tradition, is that God rules all things. He's the sovereign over all, of course, but there are two distinct ways that we can speak about God's rule according to Scripture. God is, on the one hand, he's the creator of all things and the sustainer of all things, even of this fallen world, through his common grace. And he upholds the natural order and upholds the human social order, including what we think of as the areas of politics and law and economics and the like. And then on the other hand, God also has a redemptive rule. He, in his incarnate Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, has executed a plan of redemption and has gathered a covenant people for himself, now under the new covenant, the New Testament church. And we as Christians are participating in both of these kingdoms, in both of these rules of God. We are beneficiaries of his common grace rule, and we participate in the institutions of this world alongside of unbelievers. And at the same time, we are citizens of Christ's everlasting kingdom. And as members of his church, we receive all the saving blessings of that kingdom, in part now and then fully when the kingdom comes in its fullness on the last day. Maybe moving to the second part of your question about classical liberalism. Now, I would say that what I just summarized with, I think, the basics of the Reformed Two Kingdoms doctrine, I think that can be taken in some different directions. And there have been different ways that Reformed theologians have tried to apply or implement that basic theological framework in practical life. I would defend what you might say is a view of political life in which we as Christians seek to live in peace with all people as far as possible, and in which our civil law and civil politics gives a wide berth to religious freedom, in which no particular church or religious body is established as the dominant or the politically favored religious body. So I would say, for one thing, I think it would be improper to identify Reformed Christianity, or even like more specifically Reformed Two Kingdoms doctrine, with any modern political philosophy. I just think it would be anachronistic. It would, I think, unduly associate our theology, our church, our confessional commitments with a particular earthly political movement. And I think that would just be dangerous and unwarranted. But having said that, it does seem to me that a classical liberal approach to political life is the one that is most consistent with my commitments as one who holds to the Reformed Two Kingdoms idea. So of the available options, I would say this seems to get closest to what I would think is the right way to look at things. You use the term classical liberalism. If I could just say a few things about that. And I think probably for a lot of listeners, when they hear liberalism, it's a really bad word. In theology, it means you reject the authority of Scripture and reject traditional theological doctrines. And in politics, it means left-wing progressive politics. And I think in the conversation we're having here, liberalism does not mean that. And I think we would all share that that's not the kind of classical liberalism that we're focused on. I would call it liberalism as a polity rather than as a philosophy. I would not share a kind of idea of liberalism that views religion as simply a private matter, or that views human reason as some sort of autonomous thing, such that we can just all set aside our religious commitments and just talk with reason and come to agreement on all sorts of important things without a problem. To me, liberalism represents a way of organizing society that tries to promote a measure of peace and justice and order among as many people as possible.
In a fallen world.
And leaves largely, as far as possible, leaves individuals and families and religious bodies to be making their own decisions about, you might say, the highest philosophical and theological commitments. And so I do think that kind of vision, and I would say that I think that's the sort of the American tradition. I think our constitutional order is a classical liberal constitution in that sense. And so I do think that is probably the most consistent political philosophy that I know of to match the theological commitments that I was describing earlier.
Whatever position we're talking about is formulated in a liberal order. So even the term post-liberal, liberalism is the reference point. And I think too, with Two Kingdoms, it's definitely something that has to be applied in a liberal order. Augustine believed in the two cities. Luther, of course, talked about the two kingdoms, and then wrote a tract on why the princes should slaughter the peasants. And then, Calvin not only accedes to the burning of Servetus, but writes a treatise defending it after the fact, thinking that the state still does have, since we're oriented towards eternity, naturally, there is a joint effort going on here between the church and the state. I think they would have been appalled to having not gone through the constitutional period and not having known the American democracy, it all would have been foreign to them. And so I think the way we appeal to them is not necessarily by the way they applied it in their day, but the principles that they employed. And pluralism by itself, it seems, leads you either to say that the church needs Caesar to fulfill its mission, and will do so by forceful measures if necessary, or to something like the First Amendment. That kind of pluralism wasn't there in Geneva or in Wittenberg.
Dr. Wood, do you have any thoughts, any interaction there?
Yeah, there's a lot of threads you could explore. I think the term liberalism is itself very complicated. The term classical liberalism is often more complicated than people concede, because who are we talking about? We're talking about John Locke, who also said that Catholics couldn't hold public office. And so, I'm not saying that I defend that view. I'm just saying I think when we talk about classical liberalism, I think we often have in mind it's very clear, and we know who the figures are who represent it. But even once we start to look at those figures and tease it out, it's actually quite more complicated. Same thing with Two Kingdoms, right? Dr. VanDrunen has a particular inflection of the Two Kingdoms tradition, but it's not the only one, right? We've mentioned Calvin here. He had a particular view of the two kingdoms that can conceive of the powers as clearly distinct. We're not Erastians. We've never been Erastians, and I'm opposed to Erastianism.
You might explain that.
Yeah, even like the Westminster Divines, there was a few figures who kind of had Erastian leanings, but for the most part opposed it, which is that the monarch, the civil magistrate, is the head of the church, and then therefore kind of oversees church discipline. That was a very specific issue, but that helps then kind of be a lens to how the two powers relate. And Presbyterian political theology has pretty much always been opposed to that, and so am I. That the two powers are clearly distinct, and yet they can be coordinated in certain respects. And I would hold to a lot of kind of those older views of the magistrate has a duty towards true religion, but it doesn't oversee those matters directly. It's kind of the circus sacra theology, if people want to look that up. For instance, even like the nursing fathers motif was developed to try to explicate and make clear the indirect concern that the civil power had for these matters. They try to protect true religion and maybe promote it, but indirectly, and versus a more Erastian view. And so I would still hold to that, partly because I think public religion is just inevitable. I think this is kind of a common theme among post-liberals as well, that you will have some sort of religion that animates and is enshrined and promoted in the public order. This is, to be honest, one of the great gifts of the woke revolution, is it just reminded us, I think, of that. Like, history didn't end Fukuyama. I'm sorry. An order will be framed around a certain vision of the good. Every political order is an instantiation of a certain vision of the good, and that vision of the good will be, in some sense, religiously inspired. Even if not every individual in that society agrees with that, the public institutions will be promoting something. And morality will be enshrined and promoted, and morality is always religiously informed. And so I think most post-liberals would agree with that. One of the ways I've talked about this is there was a great little book that Truman wrote a few years ago about creeds, the creedal imperative. And one of the things he says, like, every church has a creed. Some of them are just explicit and some of them are implicit. And I think that's true also for like a public religion. Like, every polity has a public religion. Some are just less explicit and some are more so. And what Truman argues about creeds in that book, and I'm not saying Dr. Truman agrees with me on my political application of his point, but the principle is illustrative, I think, is he argues that in the ecclesiastical life, the most dangerous creeds are ones that are less explicit because they can be the most manipulative. And I think that's also true for public religion. And so I would just want to say, like, if Christianity we think is true and it promotes the best virtues and morality and even toleration, I think you can have public religion and toleration. And in fact, I think the classical Protestantism is the best to hold those two together, where you still recognize difference, right? And you carve out space for that. And so one of the other categories I use is inspired by Leslie Newbegin, is the difference between plurality as a fact and pluralism as an ideology. And so I would want to recognize not everybody's going to be a Christian, and we can carve out space for that. But what will promote kind of the soft establishment of the 20th century mainline, there was a lot of good that came out of that. That would be one example of public religion that maybe not as like going back to the magisterial reformers, but it still kind of made explicit a certain respect of the indebtedness to Christianity. Even like talking about the American tradition is another we could contest. What do we mean by that? We talk the First Amendment also then allowed state establishments, and so not everybody agreed with the way we talk about the First Amendment. That's kind of a Warren Court innovation, right? I mean, in the last century, that's fine. We might agree. We might argue that that's a good development. But even if we're talking about the American tradition, I think even that is a little bit more complicated. There were, blasphemy laws. There were withholding opportunity for public office for people who didn't endorse the Christian faith,
or even
like
Congregationalism and Anglicanism.
Yeah, and then there was even like certain states where I had different forms of establishment where you could use tax monies to provide for ministers. I tend to not promote that. James Bannerman's actually really good on this. He talks about different types of establishments. Some types use state fundings to supply minister salaries, and some don't. They just explicitly identify the Christianity as the religion that is broadly supported. When I talk about the necessity of public promotion of true religion, I'm not viewing that from the side of the church's need. I'm viewing that from the side of the state's need. I think this Psalm 2, like, kiss the Son, lest it go bad for you. I actually think it's bad for politics to not honor God, not that it's bad for the church. So when I engage this conversation, and I think that's true for a lot of post-liberals, I think a lot of people assume that about post-liberals. It's like they're just trying to grab onto power because they want the church to have authority, and they feel like we can't promulgate the gospel without this. And I actually don't hear most post-liberals talking about. There are some, certainly, but they actually think it's detrimental for public order to deny God.
Dr. Horton and Dr. VanDrunen, where do you see compatibility and maybe incompatibility with at least what you've articulated? Maybe there's more commonality, but if you could push back, or if you feel like there needs to be any.
I think one thing that I would want to say is that the sort of liberalism that I would support is not one that is trying to exclude religion or religious people, or even discussions that bring religion into the public square. And one of the reasons that I would embrace some sort of a general liberalism is that it puts the state in its place. It recognizes a very limited jurisdiction for the state. And this might be an issue where we have some difference as to just how much jurisdiction the state has. It seems to me that our political and legal orders are grounded in the Noahic covenant of Genesis 9. That is a common grace covenant that gives a fairly narrow jurisdiction to the use of the sword, and that doesn't discriminate between those who hold particular sorts of religious positions as long as they are peaceful people. But I think if you have a limited state, that opens up the public life, the economic life, the legal life, the artistic, scientific, whatever life of the community to all sorts of people and to all sorts of institutions that are free to explore these various areas of life in ways that accord with their own conscience and their own convictions, and are able to bring those convictions to that work. So it does seem to me that if there's a sense in which I agree that our public life can never be it's not morally neutral. And of course, there's always a religious dimension to our morality. So I think we have an agreement on that. I think I would want to make a case that actually the Christian scriptures and our Christian theology actually promote a very limited jurisdiction for the state. And so promoting something like the liberal vision is actually a consistent application of our Christian religious beliefs.
But if the state is going to not be neutral, then it should be very defined and circumscribed, ideally, so that it can't influence religion. But I guess then you're talking about not just politically, but culturally, the cultural influences. Be interested to hear how your version of post-liberalism would advance cultural influence of Christians when a very small minority of even Christians would share that cultural vision. Are there enough people for it, is what I'm asking.
Yeah. I mean, whenever you're trying to think creatively at a radical level of alternatives to the present order, you're going to be a minority. But I don't think that makes that investigation fruitless, right? I mean, and also, as we know, like Nassim Taleb, right? Motivated minorities can actually sway things quite a bit down the road. So we'll see what could come of these things. I've engaged Dr. VanDrunen's work on Genesis 9, and there's a compelling argument there. I just think there is a lot of other scripture to factor in that I think could be brought to bear upon the conversation. Like, for instance, just like kind of classical two kingdoms figures, like looking at the two different authorities in Deuteronomy 17, or like, different passages that come out, especially like in Aaron Rod's Blossoming by George Gillespie, who's a major figure among the Westminster Divines, or Francis Turretin's work, or others that brought them to a more classical two kingdoms view of the coordinated powers relationship between the powers. And then also, like Romans 13, viewing the civil magistrate as like a deacon, of divine authority and a representative. And 1 Peter 3, like to promote the good and to penalize evil and to be a warning to those who do evil. Well, those are all moral frameworks. And again, morality and religion, they're just going to be so intertwined. And so, or even just like classical conceptions of how the two laws, but two tables of the law work together and does, and so that's a bigger conversation and maybe take us too far afield. But now getting to what are we promoting culturally if we have a, minority? Well, we try to persuade people of these views. We're trying to proclaim truth insofar as we, in the liberal order affords us that opportunity, right? And so we're trying to articulate our case. But I do also think, there's a lot of cultural institutions that we could be thinking about how to change people's minds. I mean, for instance, I brought up the kind of the woke revolution. You could talk about kind of the sexual revolution as well. Like a lot of those things, there is a relationship between civil and cultural powers, but it's not only one or the other. And so I think Christians should be thinking pretty creatively about media that they're producing to show that Christianity is good and beautiful. There's just a video that popped up today on Twitter about Volvo did a commercial. It was a beautiful portrayal of family life. And it's like, it moves you to tears. But that's a natural order that Christianity endorses and promotes and clarifies. And we could be thinking about a lot of cultural endeavors, I think, like that to change minds. And I'm not opposed to that at all. Our particular inflection of post-liberalism that Peter Leithart and I promote is not entirely centered on state instruments. That's more true of some versions of post-liberalism. But that's definitely, we would also support very strongly a variety of cultural mechanisms that we should be thinking about.
You made a reference to Deuteronomy and the coordination of civil and I don't know what you would say, religious or
like Gillespie
calls
them. He calls them two Sanhedrins, which is very interesting. I think that's Gillespie, and I think Turretin has something of that, and the Jus Divinum, which was a document that tried to expound on the political and ecclesiastical vision of the Westminster Confession. Also, I think uses that language.
The I guess my question, and there's also sort of an inherent objection there. Just to hear your thoughts on that. So older Reformed thinking that did believe in this close coordination of the civil and ecclesiastical powers. Almost entirely the justifications from Scripture come from the Old Testament. And they're appealing to texts that are coming from the Mosaic Law or the Mosaic Theocracy, in which, as I read those, it seems clear that both what we would call the civil power, the king, the judges, and as well as the priests and those who are what we might think of as the ecclesiastical power, kind of anachronistic terms, but that these are actually in one covenant with God. They're both under this Mosaic covenant, an administration of the covenant of grace.
The church is a nation.
Yeah, that's right. And that, now under the new covenant, the church is the covenant body, and God has not entered a covenant, saving covenant relationship with the civil magistrate. And I guess I just wonder how that affects the way you think about this.
Well, all those figures, I think another figure would be one of the figures I've engaged quite a bit in critiques of Kuyper is P.J. Houdemacher, and he also builds similar arguments. And he looks at those two communities, even in the Old Testament, and it's a little bit messier than I think we often think. Like you could be a member of the civil community and not a member actually of the ecclesiastical community and vice versa. And they draw attention to that. And then Houdemacher and others say it's only the Roman Catholics and the Anabaptists that don't actually see that tension. They actually oversimplify, that they make them two concentric circles, the communities. And so I think there's a lot of interesting Reformed reflection on that point. But then the other thing is I've done more work on like Augustine. So I'm writing a couple of books on Augustine. I've worked pretty closely with City of God. But it's really fascinating how Augustine talks about these things of like the New Testament, you don't have a lot of articulation about how these powers relate. And he kind of views it because it was a minority religion in a state of persecution. And yet he kind of views it as like a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. And he doesn't go far as Eusebius, right? He pulls back a Eusebian enthusiasm where it's like Constantine comes and it's like the millennium. No, he doesn't do that. But he does see the civil powers responding to the witness of the church as kind of a partial fulfillment of old like Psalm prophecies, right? That I mentioned, Psalm 2 and others. And so he says, like, yeah, and the New Testament authors, though, they weren't writing in that circumstance. The powers had not received the witness. And, but, I would just offer maybe as another angle to answer your question is Peter Leithart's really provocative challenge, like the Hauerwasians, which is similar to O'Donovan's challenge, is, a lot of times the Christians often, when they think about how they relate to those Old Testament offices, they kind of consider themselves as the prophets, right? Where the prophets speaking truth to power or something like that. And then Peter asks, like, well, what happens when the powers listen? What happens when the kings listen? Well, that's Christendom, right? And that doesn't mean Christendom and those sorts of arrangements were perfect. But do we have any sort of consideration where the powers would listen to the witness of the church and promote what is good and true and all of those things? And so building on Augustine and Peter, I think that's where I would kind of see, like, there's some silence in the New Testament, though I did reference, like, 1 Peter 3 about promoting the good and punishing evil. Well, what is the good? And, well, the ultimate good, the common good is God himself, right? And so I think there are ways that you could expand on even New Testament passages, but I would kind of agree with Augustine, like, in that period, that opportunity wasn't really there. So, but I don't rule it out as a possibility.
Here at Sola, we encourage disciples and equip disciple makers by drawing on the riches of the Reformation to apply historic Christian theology to all of faith and life. Our work is only possible thanks to the generosity of thousands of supporters across the world. In order to keep our resources free, we need your support. Will you prayerfully consider a donation to help us equip and encourage even more people to grow in knowing God and seeing everything in his light? If so, please visit solamedia.org/donate.
What about it? Not only the impact on the rulers, the rulers listened, but what happens when the rulers listen and the church itself becomes corrupted by syncretism? One of the arguments that James Madison made against giving tax-exempt status to churches is that the state would be involved in discriminating, deciding what is a church, a legitimate church. That would give the state more authority than it should be allowed, and he goes on to this excursus about how have we not learned our lesson from the old world? Have we not learned our lesson from Christendom that it has always corrupted the church whenever the church is allied with the state? That doesn't seem to me to be just a liberal argument, but something he got from John Witherspoon, who taught him two kingdoms.
Yeah, my view about how the powers relate is it's always going to be tension. Actually, I did my dissertation on Henri de Lubac, 20th century French Catholic, who is a version of an early version of a type of post-liberalism, but one that fits more with what Peter and I's project is, which is more church-centered. But one of the things he says that I found so inspiring is, like, there's no stable resolution to the relationship between these two powers. Like, it will always be influx and intention. So, and I would want to uphold that. I think you had a quote from one of my articles, and as we were preparing for this, but I'm also very influenced by Pierre Monod, one of the leading political theorists of our day in France. And he calls the church a theological political problem. He's kind of adopting, like, Leo Strauss's categories, but he's not focusing. Leo Strauss kind of focuses on the relationship between reason and revelation. Monod focuses on the relationship between church and state on here. Is like, the church is a problem to the state. The church is a problem to political society because it presents itself as a unique social body within the world that calls all peoples to itself and relativizes every political entity. And it will always do that. I think there will always be a tension, and that tension means any situation where you think you've solved it, you're already on the road to compromise. And I think that happens also in liberal orders. We've also compromised in our self-conception in a liberal order. And I think there's compromises in Christendom orders as well. And I think that we're never going to escape that, I think, is just maybe it's a cop-out answer, but I think it's really true. I think we need to be on our toes, aware of how we're being complicit with worldly ideologies. So I wouldn't endorse every form that Christendom took and every way that church cozied up to power. Absolutely not. And I don't want to subscribe to all the ways that we marginalize what is unique and beautiful and true about the church in the present liberal order.
So what you're saying is you were in favor of the Crusades?
Yeah. That's
No,
the evangelistic crusades of Billy Graham.
there you go. Yeah, there you go.
I did come to faith through a campus crusade, so
Awesome.
my little nod.
Awesome. Maybe just I have a question for Dr. VanDrunen and Dr. Horton, if you want to chime in as well. But just thinking about promotion of the good, there's a way to look at that doesn't include like tell me which God to worship and how to worship him. So that specifically, and then also I think one of the critiques that I'm often hearing today is going back to the fact that there are different ways of parsing out the two kingdoms view. It seems to me like, and I'd maybe be curious for everybody's thoughts on this, it seems to me like there's a great desire to retrieve the sort of Protestant political theology, but also not just the sort of Protestant political theology, but this world in which there is this close relationship between the civil magistrate and the church, and one in which the magistrate does have more authority. It's a world that's different than the world we live in, at least in North America right now. So I guess, one, thinking about the good, and then two, how would you respond to the critique that this version of two kingdoms that you're talking about maybe depends too heavily on, the modern liberal order and is not faithful to the original reformers?
Well, I guess that's a lot of stuff to ask.
Sorry,
if I can just
pick
I
one,
can just try. I mean, in terms of the good, it seems to me that what the responsibility given to the civil magistrate, and I think there are good biblical theological arguments to undergird this, that the responsibilities given to the civil magistrate are to promote the good, but to promote a penultimate good, that the civil magistrate is not competent to be making the kinds of theological judgments that are necessary in order to promote the ultimate good, and that civil magistrates are not, as civil magistrates, in the covenant of grace with Christ. Getting back to some previous conversation, they may well be Christians. It's wonderful if they are Christians, but they don't hold office as Christians, and it's not I don't think it should be a requirement to be a Christian in office. And I think that the jurisdiction of civil magistrates just doesn't extend to the ultimate good. And so the penultimate goods of maintaining a peaceful and, I would say, basically just civil order. And of course, what exactly is peace and justice? Those are contestable questions, so we'd have to talk about that. But I think that would be my basic answer. Yes, they promote good, but promoting a penultimate good, while you can even say encouraging people to be seeking the ultimate good, but not making those judgments for them in terms of the doctrines they believe and the religious institutions that they establish in order to pursue those. With respect to the other question, so you're asking whether sort of the view of the two kingdoms that I would promote or that we would promote is it too dependent upon or too influenced by a modern kind of liberal order and not faithful enough to a sort of older model, something like that. Yeah. I've always tried to be very clear that I'm making some different applications than the early Reformed theologians when they talked about the two kingdoms and simultaneously promoted a pretty heavy degree of civil involvement in the church and punishment of heresy and blasphemy and the like. So I have always tried to be clear that I like the doctrine and I'm promoting a different kind of application, which I think is a more consistent application with the doctrine. So, I mean, that obviously we can have a conversation and argument about that, but I would have reasons to defend that. I do think, and I think one of you, maybe it was Mike who made this comment earlier about, there wasn't the kind of pluralism in Geneva or Wittenberg that there is here. And I think that's true. But I think part of the reason for that is, for one thing, they were much smaller places. And for another thing, there wasn't freedom to have multiple opinions. If you had a lot of opinions, you were going to be exiled, or you're going to be thrown into jail, or you might be executed. So it seems to me that whenever you have any significantly large body of people trying to live together, and you give them a certain degree of freedom that you don't put your foot on it, the political foot on it, there are going to be differences of opinion about a lot of different things. That's just how it is in a sinful, fallen world.
Even among Christians.
Even among Christians. So it seems to me that in some ways, saying our present society is much more pluralistic than an early modern society is somewhat deceptive, in that the reason there wasn't plurality because there wasn't the kind of political freedom that we now offer.
Yeah, and I guess in that sense, we're much more similar to the New Testament than we are to the Reformation era. And
in terms of the political landscape.
And in terms of applying the passages, the relevant passages, the distinction between sort of common grace ends and saving grace ends. And the ministry of word, sacrament, and discipline being given to one institution for the saving grace ends, and the common grace ends being given to many institutions, including the state. And it seems to me that when Peter speaks of the good in connection with the sword, he's saying the government has a properly coercive power, but not in the kingdom of Christ. Coercive power, even violent, if necessary, in the service of justice, but not to promote the gospel, but to promote the good, as Dave said, in that penultimate sense.
I think even classical kind of Reformed thought would agree with that, which is one of the common themes among even like Calvin and others who hold to a stronger coordination is that there's no coercing of belief. There's no first of all, it's just a theoretical impossibility. You actually can't do it. Right. And also you should not try to. Mm-hmm. And I think even like Calvin would agree with that and others. And when they're talking about the state's role, the magistrate's role on pertaining to these matters, it's always indirect. It's the circus sacra thing I mentioned, that it's around sacred matters. It's not directly about them. But like, for instance, maybe to concretize it, for instance, marriage, like how we define marriage. There's going to be a conflict here. So we can talk about plurality and tolerance. But then there's also, you see the fundamental tensions, just even how we define marriage. Like so you could say, well, we have just a thousand flowers blooming about marriage, but already that is to deny the Christian view of what marriage is. And so therefore it is already a type of imposition of like redefining publicly what marriage is. And I think it's totally licit for Christians to really fight for overturning Obergefell, and inspired by their Christian vision and saying, yeah, you could go natural law arguments, but also as a good Reformed thinker, I'm always reading nature through the lens of revelation, right? And so I'm wanting to, I want to proclaim that to the civil power, not only with natural law arguments, but also from revelation, hoping that the civil power would respond. And it doesn't mean you go around persecuting people who have alternative relationships, but we could really fight again for the public promotion of the true vision of marriage that corresponds to the biblical vision. And so that's like even just a concrete example of kind of the stuff we're talking about, and then we promote that, we celebrate it in media and things like that. We celebrate marriage and we give certain tax incentives for it and things like that. I think that is all totally licit, but it is a little bit more of even an older version of liberalism, not the present one. Some of the post-liberals are not radically entirely opposed to liberalism entirely, but definitely its current form, and trying to press some of the weak spots in liberalism. And
Dr. VanDrunen, I wonder if, I don't know that I hear you saying that that's necessarily a bad thing to do. I mean, especially we're arguing from the place of natural law with regard to thinking about some of these things like marriage and sexuality in the world, but that there's a broader question of to what extent does the church as a representation of God's kingdom on earth called to be engaged in that in broader society and establishing that vision as an institution. Would you say that's a distinction here? Because
I do think there are important distinctions to make here. And certainly I am all in favor of marriage, and that is for the good of human society. And I mean, I would say that is one of the penultimate goods that I was talking about. A marriage is not an ultimate good. Marriage is not an eschatological institution. It's an institution for this present world, and one that is for all human beings. Marriage is not for Christians; it's for Christians and non-Christians. And so, I'm all in favor of promoting the good of marriage and a good definition of marriage. And but I would see that as grounded in the natural order and not as a specifically Christian claim. In fact, I wouldn't object to, I think, what Professor Wood is saying if there's a Christian who wants to bring in more specifically theological arguments to this. But I do think there's a little danger here in that we don't want to give the impression that marriage is just a Christian thing. When we're talking about this in the civil order, we want to be very clear that this is a human good and that this is for the good of all sorts of people rather than just Christians. And I think when we as Christians, if we are only making more specifically theological arguments on issues like marriage or abortion, we can really give the impression that this is for us as Christians, but it doesn't necessarily apply to other people. So I just think, that I think that's a strategic thing that I think fits some important theological parameters as well. But I do think that, just to quick get to your other part of your question, I think it's very important to distinguish what we as Christians in our maybe private capacity or as groups of Christians outside the church, the kind of things we're doing to try to influence the political order from what the church itself is doing and from what the authority that ministers of the gospel have as they are preaching, calling people into the kingdom of Christ and trying to build up the people of God unto everlasting life. Need to be very careful about becoming political actors themselves.
Yeah, no authority except what is given by the Word of God, and to exegete, to proclaim the Scriptures, binding consciences with the Word of God, not with their own views. I think, too, a lot of people think that the Two Kingdoms position is a passive, quietistic kind of approach where you're not involved in politics. If you hold this Two Kingdoms view, you're saying that. I think two really important responses can be made. First of all, Kuyper's distinction actually between the church as organism and the church as organization. That's what I think we're talking about here. Not what can Christians do in the public sphere, even to give their Christian rationale for certain positions. But what the church as an institution can bind consciences on, and what the church can legitimately proclaim in the name of Christ to the kings. And then also with what Dave is saying there about natural law, it's actually more engaged, it seems to me, with the public sphere. It allows for more engagement, broader engagement, because you're talking about the common good, not the Christian good, not the church's good. You're talking about the common good, and you're using arguments that aren't neutral, of course, but they can be persuasive to non-Christians. So I think it's actually a more realistic, very active engagement with the world in a way that doesn't run the risk of actually losing credibility and persuasive power by giving the impression we're a minority trying to act like a majority or just trying to take power.
So when we're thinking about the good and this idea of the civil magistrate promoting the good, and we think of natural law, for example, I think one of the things that I've heard is, well, that natural law ultimately is summarized in things like the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. And so the relationship between the civil magistrate and encouraging, enforcing, what that looks like. I think this is something that I see coming up in discussions. You even mentioned it earlier, like the relationship between the first table of the law and the second table of the law. And honestly, just as a pastor, as I'm wrestling through, if we're not thinking about coercing worship or enforcing belief, what does it actually mean to see natural law upheld in the common sphere if a part of that is the sort of first table? Does that make sense? I feel like this is something that I see come up quite a bit. I don't have an answer. This is, like I said, something I'm
Just so people know, first table meaning our duty to God.
Yes,
second table
specifically. And so we're thinking about blasphemy. We're thinking about how to worship God. We're thinking also about the Sabbath in particular and worship. So a lot of these things relate to religion. And so I appreciate, James, that you brought that up, because I feel like this really does get to the heart of some of this discussion. And so if we could untangle it now for everyone, I think that would be really wonderful.
Well, I do think like the Sabbath law is a good one. That's another one.
Yeah.
But let me make one comment about the common good. The common good in classical Christian theology is God himself. And so even when we talk about like common good, I think it's a little slippery there too. I don't think it's so neatly divided. Like God is the common good. And so everybody is called to him and finds our hearts are restless until they find rest in thee, says the great Augustine in the opening page of the Confessions, right? And so like when I'm promoting also true religion, it is also a promotion of a common good. Now, that doesn't mean you coerce it. I've already said that. But the promotion of it, I don't think is antithetical to an idea of like, this is actually a common good thing. But now getting on the tables of the law, I mean, yeah, it's fascinating going back to look at the American tradition and even the spirituality of the church tradition in America, which is a 19th century inflection of the Reformed tradition in America. Charles Hodge is like one of the premier exemplars, and he promoted Sabbath laws. All of those caveats are still complicated when it comes even to these, something like first table issues. And I think promotion of the Sabbath, like of honoring the Sabbath, not forcing everyone to go to church, but saying, having blue laws, right? I don't think that is in any way an imposition on people's consciences or forcing belief or anything like that. And that would promote true religion in a way that I think is appropriate to the civil magistrate. It might not happen today. Nobody's talking about what's realistic. Donald Trump's in office. I don't think he cares about this. I don't rule it out.
Justin Trudeau does.
Yeah. I don't rule it out as the realm of possibilities. And I don't think it's coercive. I don't think it's... And also,
then he would have to go to church.
Yeah, that's right. And also, yeah, I mean, we'd have to force Donald to go to a real Presbyterian. Okay, sorry. And even like on heresy stuff in the, the Servetus affair is tragic. But oftentimes when we're talking about the blasphemy laws, those are still not just like anybody who was privately like had a wrong view. It was like false teachers who were disrupting civil order. And so even oftentimes, even the civil magistrate's role there was related to how this was very socially disruptive. Like, and Servetus is a messy figure. Go look at the details of the whole story, right? I'm not endorsing Calvin's views on Servetus, but it wasn't just like Servetus was like this nice guy and he like had some bad views on the Trinity. But so, yeah, I think on the tables of the law, the magistrate still, even if you hold a more classical view on this, and then the magistrate has some responsibility for the first table, it's still less direct than the second table. So even in a classical view, so the ultimate thing is one way of framing it, but also direct and indirect, I think, is just another way. Even if you view him having a concern for the whole table, the whole 10 rules, whole 10 words, it doesn't mean he's directly overseeing those things.
Would there be, in your view, your ideal?
Okay.
Because you're a post-millennialist, I can tell.
No,
you're not?
I'm a millennial. Yeah.
Are you really?
Yeah.
Okay, but an optimistic amillennialist.
I am just, none of my political views are based on my eschatology in that sense.
The worst term ever invented.
Yeah, my political views are more based on nature, anthropology, truth, than they are on what I can expect in this time.
Okay. That itself is an interesting point. But I wanted to ask your ideal. Let's say this is what you'd love to see. Mm-hmm. Would it be an established church? And if so, would that church be Roman Catholic, or would it be Presbyterian, or would it be Lutheran, or what would it be? Great. And if you have to make it sufficiently broad for it to actually be a realistic hope, what kind of mongrel church would that be?
Yeah, it's great. I'm glad you brought to the church, because actually that is what our podcast, the hottest podcast on the web, Civitas, is. We are focused on the church on these matters, and that is relevant to your question. So first of all, my ideal would be the church would be united under the lordship of Jesus. So the Roman Catholic Church would receive the Reformation and repent And
You really are hopeful.
Yeah.
you said my idea.
Right.
That's what Calvin wanted.
Yeah,
right? And
absolutely.
So I'm not giving up on Calvin's vision. I think we have to deal with the West. I don't think bypassing and going east is the right answer for our predicaments in the West. So that the Catholic Church would receive the Reformation, and then we'd have a united, reformed, small c Catholic Church in the West. That would be a witness to the truth to the magistrate, and the magistrate would honor that in certain various ways. We could debate, but so two more answers to it very briefly. I also think in the American experiment, like a pan-Protestant soft establishment works. Like the mid 20th century, I don't think is, and if you dealt with some of the race issues that popped up in the civil rights era, so the mid 20th century soft pan-Protestant establishment that dealt with race, that also sounds pretty good. Now, realistically. Peter has actually been very helpful of like micro-Christendom. So start where we are. You get a bunch of get like a local consistory, of Nicene Christians, not nice Christians. I mean, it's good if they're nice, but Nicene. They believe in Trinitarian, classical, theistic doctrines, and you unite in some way that's visible. And we speak with a united front on the matters that are appropriate for the church to speak, even in. That's a bigger debate of the organism institution. I agree, but like there are some matters that I think we can, even as institutional bodies, speak to. They're not common, but there are some matters that are fundamental, and we have a biblical word to say to that. So I think that for now, in the provisional sphere, in the meantime, in your city, try to build some little micro-Christendoms of those churches rallying together, praying together, and speaking truth to the powers.
It certainly is a traditional Christian view that the natural law speaks to what we would call both tables, and we could argue about some of the, how detailed is natural law about the Sabbath. I think that's that's different from don't murder or don't steal. So, but just to accept that in general, I think that when we say then that the civil magistrate is in some way under the natural law, that doesn't mean that the civil magistrate has jurisdiction to enforce everything in the natural law. I think that would be another step that would have to be argued. So I think we've always recognized that there are some things in the Decalogue that the civil magistrate can enforce. I mean, can't enforce the 10th commandment. So just because something is part of the natural law doesn't mean it's automatically under the jurisdiction of the civil magistrate.
Doesn't enforce every lie. Yeah. When you lie to your mom, the civil magistrate doesn't come in.
So we have to have the further conversation then, what is under the jurisdiction of the civil magistrate? And I think it's also really important if we're talking about issues of religious liberty and establishment and all the kinds of variations of those questions that we've been talking about, that the natural law does reveal that we should worship the true God and not be idolaters. But it doesn't, we've always thought as Christians that natural revelation itself doesn't reveal the Trinity. It doesn't reveal the atonement. It doesn't reveal justification by faith alone. It doesn't reveal what the true sacraments are. And it doesn't reveal the name of God. And so if we are really thinking about a civil magistrate operating under the natural law, then the civil magistrate doesn't have the sort of theological information in order to be making any kind of detailed judgments about what exactly is heresy, what exactly is blasphemy, what exactly is the true church. I mean, how do you even distinguish between Roman Catholics or Lutherans or Reformed on the basis of natural revelation? I would say it's impossible. So I think some people act as if it's a kind of a simple question. Well, natural law has to do with the first table of the law as well as the second. Therefore, the civil magistrate needs to be,
enforcing
in the business of somehow enforcing and promoting first table matters. I don't think that follows from that. There's
the
much
church
more.
Still has an obligation to proclaim to the powers the whole law. We would still affirm that the church,
If the law is in the scriptures, it proclaims the whole scriptures.
Yeah,
so.
exactly. So we do proclaim the scriptures to the God's commands, but the commands that are summarized in the 10 Commandments. Then Christians in various fields, not at the church as an institution, but Christians in their callings, their vocations, might need to persuade people of that good, particularly using natural law arguments. And that is neighbor love. That is, it's not extending Christ's kingdom, his saving reign, but it certainly is a means through which Christ, in his providence, rules the world and restrains wickedness.
So it sounds like we're maybe closing on a note of concord and agreement. I mean, at least in terms of maybe like the first table of the law is not something that can be enforced in the exact same way that the second table is enforced.
I think that's in classical thought too.
Yeah. And so some distinctions that are helpful, maybe not saying it too simplistically. Again, I appreciate all of your guys' time and willingness. Hopefully we can do some more of these down the line. Dr. Wood, appreciate your contribution. And Dr. Horton, Dr. VanDrunen, thank you very much.